The Battle of Trafalgar, October 1805. Admiral Horatio Nelson deliberately ordered the British fleet to do what Royal Navy doctrine explicitly warned against. He broke his own line. He split 27 ships into two narrow columns. And he sailed them straight, at a right angle, into the guns of the combined French and Spanish fleet. For nearly half an hour, British ships could barely fire back. They absorbed punishment by design. One accurate response from the enemy could have shattered the entire attack before it even reached contact. Yet the battle ended with a decisive British victory, and Nelson dead on his own deck. Why would an experienced commander abandon the safest formation ever devised for naval warfare? What did Nelson believe would collapse on the enemy's side before his own fleet collapsed first? And was this decision a controlled strategic breakthrough, or a gamble balanced on assumptions no one could truly verify? This is not the story of a bold maneuver. It is the story of a commander who chose to weaponize disorder, and accepted the cost before knowing the outcome. The strategic problem at Trafalgar was not how to win a naval battle. It was how to force a decisive outcome against an enemy that could avoid decisive defeat. By 1805, Britain already controlled the seas in practice, but not in finality. The combined French-Spanish fleet did not need to destroy the Royal Navy. It only needed to survive, remain a threat, and preserve political leverage for Napoleon's broader war on land. A conventional line of battle engagement risked exactly that: an inconclusive fight, mutual damage, and a fleet that could withdraw and regroup. Nelson faced a paradox. If he followed doctrine, he might fight correctly, and still fail strategically. If he broke doctrine, he might win decisively, or lose everything. This is why Trafalgar qualifies as an unorthodox strategy, not because it looked unusual, but because it inverted the hierarchy of priorities. Nelson accepted tactical exposure in exchange for systemic collapse on the enemy's side. He was not trying to outshoot the opposing fleet. He was trying to destroy its ability to function as a fleet at all. The question, then, is not whether the maneuver was brave. The real question is why this was the only option left, and why it was almost impossible to justify on paper. To understand that, we need to examine the strategic map that boxed both sides into a narrowing set of choices. The situation before Trafalgar was not a clean duel between two fleets seeking battle. It was a strategic stalemate disguised as motion. Britain's Royal Navy had one overriding objective: remove the combined French-Spanish fleet as a viable force. Not damage it. Not delay it. Eliminate it as a strategic variable. As long as that fleet existed, Napoleon retained optionality, the ability to threaten invasion, divert British resources, and manipulate uncertainty. The opposing objective was fundamentally different. The combined fleet did not need victory. It needed survival. Every day it remained afloat, Britain had to treat it as a threat. That asymmetry shaped every decision before the first shot was fired. This difference in objectives already tilted the strategic map against conventional engagement. Geography compounded the problem. Trafalgar was not fought in confined waters where maneuver was limited. It was open sea. Space favored disengagement. A damaged fleet could withdraw. A cautious commander could preserve force. A textbook line of battle fight offered no guarantee of decisive annihilation. Time was another constraint, but not equally distributed. Britain needed closure. Prolonged uncertainty drained resources and political patience. The French-Spanish command could afford delay. Even an indecisive clash worked in their favor if it preserved enough holes to remain credible. Then there was the condition of the fleets themselves. British crews were experienced, drilled relentlessly, and accustomed to long deployments. The combined fleet was not incompetent, but it was heterogeneous. Different command cultures. Different training standards. Different expectations about initiative. These differences did not guarantee defeat, but they created friction under stress. Friction matters only if stress is applied in the right way. Politically, Nelson was constrained as well. A cautious battle that failed to destroy the enemy would be difficult to justify. Britain had invested too much to accept a partial outcome. Yet a catastrophic defeat would not be forgiven simply because the plan was bold. There was no institutional appetite for heroic failure. This placed Nelson in a narrowing corridor. Every conventional option led to outcomes that were strategically insufficient. Every unconventional option carried risks that could not be fully mitigated. The enemy's biggest strength was not firepower. It was optionality. The ability to disengage, to reform, to continue existing as a problem. As long as the fleet remained coherent, it retained political value regardless of tactical results. That coherence depended on structure. Line of battle doctrine was not just a way to fight. It was a way to think. It assumed predictable geometry, stable command relationships, and a shared understanding of how the battle would unfold. Nelson recognized that this structure was both a strength and a vulnerability. If the battle remained within expected parameters, the combined fleet could manage risk, absorb losses, and preserve itself. If those parameters collapsed, its advantages dissolved rapidly. But forcing that collapse required creating a situation the doctrine could not process quickly enough. There was also a hidden constraint rarely addressed in popular accounts: communication. Flag signals governed maneuver. Once smoke, damage, and confusion intervened, centralized control weakened. Doctrine assumed this degradation would be gradual and manageable. Nelson's emerging concept assumed it would be sudden and terminal. This was not an assumption without cost. To exploit the enemy's rigidity, Nelson had to accept vulnerability on his own side. The moment his columns advanced, British ships would be exposed, unable to reply effectively, and dependent on timing they could not fully control. Any misalignment, any delay, any unexpected concentration of enemy fire could unravel the entire design. This was not a choice between aggression and caution. It was a choice between two different kinds of risk. One slow, politically corrosive, and strategically inconclusive. The other immediate, violent, and potentially fatal. Nelson chose the risk that ended the problem. But that choice only makes sense when we understand what the doctrine of the time demanded, and why following it would have produced the wrong kind of success. Because before Nelson could break the enemy's formation, he first had to break with everything the naval textbook insisted was correct. Naval doctrine in 1805 was not merely a set of recommendations. It was an entire worldview. The line of battle existed to solve one problem above all others: control. Ships formed a single, extended line so that every vessel could bring its broadside to bear while maintaining visual and command coherence. The geometry was deliberate. The logic was conservative. The outcome, in theory, was predictable. For most admirals, this was not cowardice. It was professionalism. Doctrine promised three things. First, it minimized exposure. No ship advanced alone into concentrated fire. Second, it preserved command authority. Signals traveled along a known axis. Third, it limited chaos. Even when damage occurred, the battle remained legible to those in charge. In a symmetrical fight, two fleets seeking mutual destruction, this made sense. But Trafalgar was not a symmetrical fight. If Nelson had followed doctrine, the battle would likely have unfolded as countless others had before it. Two lines closing. Broadsides exchanged. Ships damaged on both sides. Smoke thickening. Command signals degrading slowly, not catastrophically. And then, disengagement. The combined fleet did not need to win that exchange. It needed to survive it. Even a battered fleet could retreat, repair, and remain strategically relevant. Doctrine optimized for fairness. Strategy demanded finality. This is the first dead end. A textbook engagement would have produced a tactically respectable outcome, and a strategically insufficient one. Britain would still face a fleet in being. Political uncertainty would persist. Resources would remain tied down. The war's maritime dimension would remain unresolved. Doctrine had no answer for that. There was a second, more subtle problem. Line of battle warfare assumed that both sides shared the same operational tempo and command culture. It worked best when discipline, training, and initiative were roughly equivalent. That assumption masked a vulnerability. The combined fleet structure was rigid. Orders flowed top-down. Initiative at the ship level was limited. This was not a moral failing. It was a product of organizational design. Doctrine assumed that cohesion would hold under pressure because pressure would be distributed evenly along the line. Nelson saw an opportunity in that assumption. If pressure were not distributed, if it were concentrated suddenly at specific points, the structure would not flex. It would fracture. But Doctrine offered no mechanism for creating that kind of asymmetry without exposing oneself to unacceptable risk. Which brings us to the third dead end. Every orthodox alternative Nelson considered shared the same flaw. They preserved safety at the cost of decisiveness. They minimized loss at the cost of resolution. They protected ships while protecting the enemy's continued existence. To choose Doctrine was to choose a battle that could be explained, defended, and survived, but not one that could end the problem. The uncomfortable truth is that Doctrine was correct within its own assumptions. It failed only because those assumptions no longer aligned with strategic reality. The system worked. The objective had changed. This is the moment where most commanders stop. They accept the limits of the system. They manage risk. They defer closure. Nelson did not. He asked a different question. Not, how do I fight correctly, but what must break for this war at sea to end? Answering the question required discarding the very logic that had defined naval professionalism for generations. And once that line was crossed, there was no safe way back. Because breaking Doctrine is easy in theory, but turning that break into a coherent decision is where most strategies collapse. The decision at Trafalgar did not emerge as a single moment of inspiration. It formed under pressure, inside a narrowing strategic envelope, where every conventional option led to a result Nelson could not accept. By the time contact became inevitable, Nelson was no longer searching for a better version of existing doctrine. He was searching for a way around it. What matters here is not whether others disagreed with him. Many did. What matters is why disagreement could not stop the decision, and why the internal resistance never crystallized into an alternative plan. There was no formal mutiny of ideas, no recorded vote. Naval command culture did not work that way. But there was skepticism. Quiet concern. A shared awareness that what Nelson was proposing would expose the fleet in a way no admiral was trained to justify. The resistance was not emotional. It was structural. The plan violated the deepest professional instinct of senior officers: maintain mutual support at all times. By dividing the fleet into two attacking columns, Nelson ensured that for a significant period, ships at the front would be isolated. They would not be covered. They would not be rescued quickly. They would absorb damage without reciprocal effect. No amount of personal loyalty could erase that reality. What allowed the decision to move forward was not persuasion alone, but hierarchy combined with reputation. Nelson had accumulated credibility through previous engagements. He was known for trusting his captains. He was known for aggressive intent. This did not make the plan safe. It made it possible. But credibility does not explain the logic. The unorthodox decision rested on a small number of core assumptions. None of them were provable in advance. All of them had to hold simultaneously. The first assumption concerned timing. Nelson assumed that his columns could close the distance before suffering irreversible damage. This was not optimism. It was calculation under uncertainty. He accepted that ships would be hit. He gambled that they would not be disabled early enough to halt momentum. If this assumption failed, the battle would end before it truly began. The second assumption concerned enemy reaction. Nelson believed the combined fleet would not be able to adapt its formation quickly enough. Not because its commanders lacked intelligence, but because its system lacked flexibility. Signals would be slow. Authority would hesitate. The instinct to preserve line integrity would delay decisive counteraction. This was a bet against organizational reflexes. The third assumption was the most dangerous. Nelson assumed that once contact occurred, decentralized initiative on the British side would outperform centralized command on the opposing side. This meant relinquishing control at the very moment Doctrine demanded tighter grip. In other words, Nelson designed a battle he could not fully command. This is where the decision stops looking like bold tactics and starts resembling systemic manipulation. The attack was not aimed primarily at hulls or cannons. It was aimed at the enemy's command architecture. By piercing the line in two places, Nelson intended to sever communication between sections of the fleet. Rear units would be unable to support the center. The van would be forced to choose between turning back or continuing forward, neither option clean. Once that fragmentation occurred, the enemy would no longer be fighting as a fleet. It would be fighting as disconnected clusters of ships, each reacting locally, without a shared operational picture. That fragmentation was the true objective. But fragmentation is not guaranteed simply by contact. It depends on confusion, on smoke, on damage, on hesitation. Nelson's plan did not create those effects by itself. It assumed they would emerge naturally once the structure was violated. That assumption is rarely emphasized, but it is critical. The plan had no redundancy. If the enemy responded with unexpected decisiveness, concentrating fire, sacrificing formation, counterattacking the columns aggressively, the British fleet could be punished severely before achieving penetration. There was no secondary scheme, no fallback alignment, no graceful exit. This was not negligence. It was the consequence of designing a strategy around collapse rather than control. Internally, this placed a unique psychological burden on the commander. Nelson was not merely ordering ships forward. He was ordering them into a situation where outcomes would diverge rapidly and irreversibly. Once committed, no signal could restore coherence if things went wrong. This is the often missed element of the decision: irreversibility. Most doctrine-based plans allow adjustment, course correction, gradual escalation. Nelson's did not. The moment the columns advanced, the fleet crossed a threshold. Beyond it, success and disaster separated quickly. That irreversibility is why the plan cannot be reduced to bravery. Bravery implies courage under known risk. This was something else. It was acceptance of unknown variance, with no institutional safety net. The decision also targeted a specific psychological vulnerability. The combined fleet's commanders were trained to maintain order, to preserve alignment, to correct deviations. Nelson's approach forced them to choose between responding to immediate threats and maintaining structural integrity. That dilemma had no clean solution. If they broke formation to counter the columns, they violated doctrine and risked internal chaos. If they held formation, they allowed penetration that doctrine could not absorb. Either response degraded effectiveness. Nelson was not counting on confusion alone. He was counting on hesitation born of conflicting priorities. This is why the plan is better understood as a cognitive attack rather than a maneuver. The decision did not ask, can we outfight them? It asked, can we force them to fight in a way they are not organized to sustain? The answer was uncertain. It remained uncertain until the last moment. And that uncertainty applied equally to Nelson himself. There is no evidence he believed success was guaranteed. What he believed was that every other path led to strategic stalemate. This distinction matters. Nelson did not choose the plan because he was confident. He chose it because it was the only option that could end the problem entirely. In doing so, he accepted something most commanders avoid acknowledging, that sometimes the safest strategy is the one that exposes you the most, provided it collapses the system you are facing faster than your own collapses. But theory ends where execution begins. Once the decision was made, it had to survive reality. Wind, timing, human error, fear, misinterpretation. And this is where unorthodox strategies most often fail. Because designing a systemic collapse is one thing. Forcing it to occur under fire is another entirely. Execution is where unorthodox strategy is usually exposed. On paper, collapse looks clean. At sea, nothing is clean. Once Nelson committed to the two-column advance, the plan entered a phase where control diminished by the minute. Wind speed mattered. Ship handling mattered. Damage tolerance mattered. Most critically, timing mattered, not in hours, but in minutes. The two British columns were not symmetrical. They did not advance at identical speeds. They did not face identical resistance. This alone introduced variance the plan could not fully regulate. A delay in one column would expose the other to concentrated fire without reciprocal pressure. The mechanics were brutally simple. British ships sailed directly toward the enemy line. Their bows faced incoming broadsides. Guns could not bear effectively forward. For a significant interval, each ship functioned as a target rather than a combatant. This was not a metaphorical vulnerability. It was physical geometry. Hull damage during this phase was not evenly distributed. Ships at the head of the columns absorbed disproportionate punishment. If a leading vessel were dismasted or lost steering, it could block those behind it. Momentum would stall. The column would compress. What was designed as penetration could turn into congestion under fire. That risk was real, and it nearly materialized. The plan assumed that British crews could maintain discipline under direct, unanswered bombardment. This was not guaranteed. Training mattered here more than bravery. Crews had to resist the instinct to slow, to turn, to seek mutual support. Any hesitation would lengthen exposure time and magnify damage. Logistics rarely feature in Trafalgar narratives, but they were central to execution. British ships were prepared for close combat. Gun crews drilled for rapid, sustained fire at short range. This mattered only if they survived long enough to use that advantage. A strategy that delays engagement cannot rely on theoretical firepower. It relies on survivability. The columns also depended on navigation precision. Penetration points had to be accurate enough to split the enemy line into isolated segments. If a ship broke through too close to another, the effect would be localized. If too far apart, coordination between British units would degrade. There was no central correction mechanism once the approach began. Signals were limited. Smoke obscured flags. Noise drowned out commands. Each captain interpreted intent based on prior understanding, not real-time instruction. This is where Nelson's earlier cultural investment paid dividends. He had cultivated a command climate in which captains understood objectives rather than scripts. They were not waiting for instructions. They were acting on shared intent. But shared intent does not eliminate risk. One of the most fragile aspects of the plan was tempo. The strategy required rapid escalation once contact occurred. The longer the enemy retained partial cohesion, the greater the chance they could adapt. Delay favored the defenders. This created a paradox. British ships had to endure fire patiently on approach, but act aggressively and independently upon penetration. Too cautious, and momentum died. Too aggressive, and units could become isolated beyond support. The transition between those modes was the most dangerous moment of the battle. This is also where microfailures could have cascaded. A misjudged turn. A collision. A gun crew disabled at the wrong moment. None of these needed to happen across the fleet. One or two critical failures could have altered the balance locally enough to blunt the overall effect. Unorthodox strategies often depend on synchronized stress. If stress is unevenly applied, the system does not collapse. It bends. There were moments when the enemy came close to exploiting this. Concentrated fire inflicted severe damage on leading ships. Casualties mounted quickly. Had the combined fleet been able to coordinate a focused counterattack on one column before the other fully engaged, the British advance might have stalled. But coordination required clarity. And clarity was exactly what the penetration was designed to deny. Once British ships cut through the line, the character of the battle changed abruptly. Instead of two organized formations, the fight fragmented into local engagements. Visibility collapsed. Signals became meaningless. Command devolved to ship-level decisions. At this point, the original plan ceased to exist in any actionable form. What remained was its intended effect. This is a critical distinction. Nelson's strategy did not guide the entire battle. It guided the battle to a threshold, beyond which the enemy's system failed faster than his own. That threshold was fragile. It existed in a narrow window between exposure and dominance. Crossing it required not just courage, but structural alignment between doctrine, training, and intent. Many strategies look brilliant after they work. Few are designed to disappear once they succeed. Trafalgar's execution phase was not about control. It was about survivable chaos. And chaos is never guaranteed to favor the side that initiates it. Which raises the next question. When the enemy finally recognized what was happening, why were they unable to recover? The combined French-Spanish fleet was not blind. What failed at Trafalgar was not perception, it was response. As the British columns advanced, the intent became increasingly clear. This was not a feint. This was not an attempt to cross the line in the conventional sense. The geometry itself signaled deviation. The threat was recognized early enough to provoke concern, but too late to enable coherent adaptation. Recognition, however, is not the same as recovery. The first problem lay in command latency. Orders within the combined fleet relied on signals that assumed relative stability. Flags required visibility. Visibility required spacing. Spacing assumed an intact line. Once the British columns began to close, those assumptions unraveled simultaneously. Commanders faced a dilemma with no doctrinal answer. If they broke formation to counter the columns, they risked dissolving the very order that allowed control. If they held formation, they allowed penetration that the line was not designed to absorb. This hesitation was not indecision. It was paralysis induced by incompatible priorities. Some units attempted localized responses. Individual ships increased fire. Others began turning to engage approaching British vessels. But these actions were uncoordinated. Each response solved an immediate problem while worsening the systemic one. The fleet began to fragment not because it was defeated, but because it was forced to solve too many problems at once. Another critical factor was cognitive inertia. The combined fleet had trained to fight a known battle. Its officers understood how a line engagement unfolded. They understood escalation within that framework. What they did not have was a shared mental model for sudden structural collapse. When doctrine does not include a recovery pathway, adaptation becomes improvisation. Improvisation under fire favors the side that planned for it. There was also an asymmetry in initiative. British captains, operating under broad intent, acted decisively once contact occurred. French and Spanish captains, operating under tighter control norms, waited for clarity that never arrived. This difference widened rapidly. As communication degraded, the fleet effectively split into disconnected zones of combat. Rear units were slow to re-enter. Forward units were drawn into isolated engagements. The center lost coherence almost immediately. At this point, the battle ceased to be a contest between fleets. It became a series of unequal encounters between ships that no longer shared situational awareness. The critical misreading was not tactical. It was structural. The combined fleet misread the British attack as an aggressive maneuver within a familiar system. It was not. It was an attempt to destroy the system itself. By the time that distinction became undeniable, the conditions required for recovery, time, space, clarity, were already gone. This is why counterfactual arguments matter here. Had the enemy reacted with immediate, collective abandonment of formation, the outcome might have differed. But that response required a level of doctrinal flexibility and decentralized authority the system did not possess. In other words, the fleet could see the danger. It simply could not move fast enough, as a whole, to escape it. This is the most uncomfortable lesson of Trafalgar. Intelligence alone is insufficient. Awareness without adaptive capacity changes nothing. The British strategy did not rely on deception. It relied on forcing the enemy to confront a problem faster than its organization could process. Once that threshold was crossed, defeat was no longer avoidable, only distributable. Which leads to the final and often romanticized phase. What did victory actually cost, and what would have happened if even one assumption had failed? The outcome at Trafalgar was decisive, but it was not clean. Decisiveness came at a cost that is often softened by victory. The combined French-Spanish fleet lost its ability to function as a strategic force. Ships were captured, destroyed, or rendered incapable of coordinated action. Britain achieved what conventional engagement could not guarantee: finality. The maritime threat that had shaped British anxiety for years was effectively removed in a single day. But this result did not emerge from dominance alone. It emerged from attrition concentrated in time and space. British losses were heavy where the strategy demanded exposure. The leading ships of the columns paid first. Crews were killed and wounded before they could meaningfully respond. Damage was uneven but severe. Several ships were left barely operational. This was not a controlled burn. It was a calculated wound. Nelson himself was killed during the battle. This was not incidental. The strategy placed command near the point of maximum friction. Leadership was not distant or abstract. It was physically embedded in the most dangerous zone of execution. That death is often framed as tragic inevitability. Strategically, it was a foreseeable consequence. Nelson accepted that personal survival was part of the wager. The plan did not protect its architect. There were also political costs. Victory froze the narrative in a favorable frame. But it also created a myth. Future commanders would cite Trafalgar without inheriting its conditions. Aggression would be copied without understanding the system Nelson attacked or the organizational asymmetries he exploited. This is the hidden danger of successful unorthodox strategy. It creates precedent without context. Psychologically, the burden was uneven. British confidence surged. The Royal Navy's institutional identity hardened around offensive decisiveness. On the opposing side, the defeat reinforced caution and rigidity rather than reform. Systems rarely learn from collapse. They retreat from it. It is also necessary to confront the counterfactual honestly. If even one assumption had failed, if the columns had stalled under fire, if a leading ship had blocked the advance, if the enemy had concentrated decisively on a single penetration point, the British fleet could have suffered catastrophic losses with no compensating gain. In that scenario, the narrative would reverse instantly. Nelson would not be remembered as a visionary. He would be judged as reckless. The same elements now praised as insight would be condemned as hubris. This is not speculation for its own sake. It reveals the fragility of the margin. Unorthodox strategies do not fail gradually. They fail suddenly. Trafalgar succeeded because multiple uncertain variables aligned just long enough for systemic collapse to outpace self-destruction. That alignment cannot be assumed. It cannot be institutionalized easily. It cannot be repeated on demand. Which forces a final question. If this strategy cannot be copied, what exactly is the lesson? Because the value of Trafalgar is not in the maneuver, but in what it reveals about how systems break. Trafalgar is often taught as a lesson in boldness. That interpretation is comfortable, and largely wrong. At its core, Nelson's strategy was not about courage, aggression, or even naval tactics. It was about identifying where a system could not adapt fast enough, and forcing it to confront that limitation under maximum stress. The British attack did not defeat the enemy by superior firepower alone. It defeated the enemy by collapsing the assumptions that made their power usable. Line of battle doctrine assumed continuity, predictability, and recoverable disruption. Nelson's approach denied all three at once. This is the first enduring principle. Unorthodox strategy does not overpower a system. It invalidates the system's rules faster than it can rewrite them. Nelson did not seek incremental advantage. He sought a condition in which advantage became irrelevant because the enemy could no longer coordinate its response. This is why the maneuver looks reckless when viewed tactically and coherent when viewed systemically. The second principle is more uncomfortable. Unorthodox strategies require asymmetry not just in ideas, but in organizations. Nelson could decentralize because his captains were trained, trusted, and culturally prepared to act without constant direction. The combined fleet could not mirror that behavior without dismantling its own command norms mid-battle. The strategy worked not because it was clever, but because it was incompatible with the enemy's structure. This matters because it limits transferability. A different commander, with a different fleet culture, executing the same maneuver could have produced disaster. The lesson is not, attack in columns. The lesson is, attack where the opponent's structure cannot survive pressure, and where yours can. The third principle concerns cost. Trafalgar demonstrates that decisive outcomes often require exposure that institutions prefer to avoid. Nelson accepted irreversible commitment. Once the columns advanced, there was no graceful exit. Strategy crossed into fate. This is not a recommendation. It is a warning. When unorthodox strategies succeed, they often do so by eliminating the possibility of retreat, for both sides. That creates clarity. It also concentrates loss. Finally, Trafalgar reveals a paradox about learning. The battle is celebrated, but rarely replicated successfully. Its surface elements are copied. Its deeper logic is not. Organizations remember outcomes. They forget conditions. They inherit confidence without inheriting constraint. Nelson did not win because he ignored doctrine. He won because he understood exactly where doctrine stopped working, and was willing to step beyond it once, and only once. That is why Trafalgar remains debated. It resists simplification. It is neither a timeless formula nor a lucky aberration. It is a case study in how strategic systems fail when confronted with pressure they were never designed to process. And that is its real value. Trafalgar ended Britain's naval uncertainty, but it did not end the argument. Because the battle forces an uncomfortable conclusion. Some strategies cannot be proven safe before they are executed. They can only be proven decisive after they succeed. Nelson's choice was not between caution and audacity. It was between managing a problem indefinitely or risking everything to end it. He chose finality, knowing that history would judge the result, not the logic. That judgment happened to favor him. But the deeper lesson remains unresolved. How many commanders mistake necessity for genius after the fact? And how many unorthodox strategies failed, not because they were wrong, but because the systems behind them were not ready to survive their own ideas? That question is where this story truly ends, and where the next one begins.